She collapsed on live television, and still didn't know I was the one who exposed it all. I'm Graham. 7 years ago, my wife, my partner of 2 decades, had an affair with her boss. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just vanished. No goodbye. No closure. Just silence. But silence isn't empty. Sometimes, it's the sound of someone rebuilding, piece by quiet piece. And when her world finally shattered, I was the only one who didn't cheer. What would you have done? Stayed and fought? Or walked away like I did? Let me know below, because sometimes, the hardest revenge is no revenge at all. They say silence says it all. But sometimes, it only echoes what we try hardest to ignore. The coffee maker hissed its last breath as Graham filled 2 mugs, one plain white, one chipped with a fading blue stripe. Lydia always took the chipped one. Said it felt more real in her hands, like something with memory. She hadn't said that in years. These days, she barely said anything at all. Outside the window, maple leaves spiraled in slow motion down the sloped front yard. October in Westbrook always had that kind of melancholy, the kind that didn't demand attention, only settled into your bones if you stood still long enough. Graham stood still often. That morning, like most, he had been up before the sun. Lydia came down 30 minutes later in her navy work slacks and the oatmeal sweater she wore every Thursday. "Coffee's hot," he offered. She nodded, pulled her travel mug from the cabinet. Didn't pour from the carafe he held out. Reached for the Keurig instead. She turned on the kitchen radio, something soft and familiar, a slow melody strumming a tune they hadn't danced to in decades. The first few notes made him blink. Fields of Gold. Sting, from the mid-90s. Their first dance at the wedding. His hand nearly tightened around the mug, but Lydia, without a glance, reached over and switched the radio off. No comment. No explanation. She just took her coffee and opened her phone. Graham's eyes caught the screen, 6:42 a.m. A text notification popped up. Lydia's lips curved into a brief smile. Then, almost reflexively, she swiped and deleted the message. She didn't notice him watching. He turned back toward the window, letting the silence reclaim the room. There was a time when he would have asked. Would have teased. Would have demanded. Now, he just noted it. Filed it somewhere private. Safe. "I have first block today," she said, slinging her purse over one shoulder. "Might have a department meeting at lunch. Don't wait dinner." "I won't," he replied. She paused briefly, maybe out of habit, maybe not. Then the front door closed behind her, and the house exhaled. By 8:15, Graham had showered, dressed in a soft plaid shirt and jeans, and was walking toward town. Cozy Brew sat on Main Street like it always had, with its uneven shingle roof and big front windows lined with orange and red paper leaves. Inside, it smelled like cinnamon and wet wood. "Morning, Mr. Ellison," called Sophie, the college-aged barista who always remembered his name, his drink, and that he didn't like whipped cream unless it was December. "Morning, Sophie." He took his usual corner booth near the window. The coffee arrived quickly, warm and heavy in his hand. He didn't read the paper. Didn't check his phone. He just watched the slow stir of Westbrook life, a father dragging a pumpkin-laden wagon, a teenage couple holding hands like something was about to end. "Room for one more," came a familiar voice. Graham looked up to see Reverend Henry Coyle. Round glasses, corduroy jacket, and a kind of calm that came from a lifetime of hearing people at their worst and loving them anyway. "Always," Graham said, nudging the sugar jar toward the middle of the table. Henry settled in with his tea. They didn't speak at first, didn't need to. "You two still going up to Portland for Thanksgiving?" Henry asked finally. Graham stirred his coffee slowly, even though he hadn't added cream or sugar. "No plans yet." Henry didn't press. "Well, if you find yourself without a table, you're welcome at ours." Graham nodded. "Appreciate it." The silence between them was easy, unlike the silence at home. Graham let his mind drift, watching Sophie refill the cream pitcher, listening to the hum of old music from the speaker overhead. Something by James Taylor. Another echo from the past. By the time he got home, the house felt colder. Not in temperature, he'd adjusted the thermostat before leaving, but in air. Like something sacred had stepped outside and wasn't sure it wanted to return. He put his mug in the sink. Lydia's travel mug was already there, half full. She must have doubled back during her planning period. He stood at the base of the stairs for a long time, looking upward, then shook his head and went to the back porch. The leaves there hadn't been raked yet. He sat on the steps and ran his hands along the grain of the railing. His wedding ring glinted faintly in the fading light. From somewhere far off, a dog barked. A car door slammed. He wondered, not for the first time, if anyone else in their town had a marriage so quiet it felt like a memory you weren't sure was yours. Later that night, Lydia returned after dark. She didn't turn on the lights in the living room. Just went straight to the kitchen, then upstairs. Graham heard the water running. Her footsteps were fast, rehearsed. He sat at the dining table, still in his clothes, watching the shadows shift on the wall. They hadn't argued in months. Hadn't laughed in longer. Sometimes silence wasn't peace, it was surrender. At 10:42 p.m., Lydia's footsteps returned. She passed through the hallway where he sat. Didn't see him at first. When she did, she paused, hand halfway to the banister. "You didn't go to bed?" "No." She nodded, then hesitated again. "Long day." Graham said nothing. She lingered another second, then turned and disappeared up the stairs. He stayed where he was, unmoving, until the old grandfather clock in the foyer chimed once. They say silence says it all. But sometimes, it only echoes what we try hardest to ignore. Graham saw her earlier that morning, 6:42 a.m., glance at her phone and smile. Then, just as quickly, she deleted the message. Sometimes the worst silence isn't between arguments. It's between two people who stop trying. The leaves on the porch hadn't been swept in days. They piled against the corners like unspoken apologies, rustling each time the wind sighed through. Graham stood at the threshold that Sunday morning, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other resting on the doorframe. The cold nipped at his knuckles. The porch had once been their shared promise. Lydia used to say, "One day, we'll grow old on that porch." Now, it felt like a waiting room neither of them entered. Henry had invited him to the early service, said something about community lifting heavy hearts. Graham hadn't agreed out loud, just nodded and shown up. The church was only 3 blocks away, its steeple modest, wooden siding weathered from Oregon's damp seasons. Inside, the light was soft, filtered through stained glass, and the scent of potpourri clung to the hymnals. He chose a pew near the back, not for distance, but perspective. Reverend Henry's voice flowed through the sanctuary like warmed honey, talking about gratitude as the Thanksgiving season approached. Graham listened, mostly. Sometimes his thoughts wandered to Lydia, who hadn't joined him in church in over a year. She said Sundays were her only chance to sleep in. Lately, even that had become less believable. After the service, he shook hands, smiled politely, accepted a cinnamon roll wrapped in wax paper from one of the older women near the coat rack. Then he turned to leave, until he heard his name. "Graham Ellison?" He turned and saw a woman in a beige sweater, hair in a loose bun, cheeks pink from the cold. There was something familiar in the way she said his name, light, but with history tucked behind it. "Lauren," he said, recognizing her instantly. She smiled. "I thought that was you." "It's been what, 10 years?" 12, he said. "Since Portland." They'd worked together for 2 years at the community college. She'd been in student advising, he in adult education. There had been a time, brief and unspoken, when things might have turned into something. But Lydia had already been in his life, and Lauren had moved to Westbrook after her mother's stroke. Life happened. Paths diverged. "I teach 5th grade now," she said, walking with him toward the exit. "At Westbrook Elementary. It's less theory, More glue sticks. He chuckled, and the sound surprised him. Good to see you again. You too, she said, pulling her scarf tighter. And Graham? He turned. If you ever want to talk. I'm still here. He didn't know what to say. So he nodded. The rest of the day passed quietly. Lydia had texted earlier, board meeting extended. Might be late. Graham didn't reply, just slid his phone back into his coat. He stopped by the bookstore on Main and picked up a new crossword collection. The owner, Marcy, asked about Lydia. He said she was keeping busy. That was true enough. By the time he got home, the afternoon light was already slipping away. He put a small pot roast in the oven, habit, really. Sundays had always meant slow-cooked meals, even if they didn't eat together anymore. Lydia walked through the door at 6:38 p.m., her hair damp from the drizzle, shoulders tense. Smells good, she said, shrugging off her coat. Dinner's ready. I already ate, she replied, glancing at the wall clock. The board ordered Thai. He didn't ask why she hadn't texted. Didn't mention that she always used to hate Thai. She sat at the table anyway, picked at a few carrots, sipped a glass of water. They didn't talk. The radio played something soft from the kitchen speaker, instrumental jazz, faceless, wordless. At 7:12 p.m., Lydia's phone lit up once, then went silent. Graham noticed it tucked under her folded napkin. Strange. She used to leave it on the counter. When she got up to rinse her glass, he casually glanced at the screen. No notification remained. Just a muted icon and a blank lock screen. When she returned, he asked, "Long day?" She nodded. Policy changes. You know how it is. He didn't. Not really. But he said nothing. Later, after she'd gone upstairs, he sat by the fireplace with his crossword book unopened in his lap. A log crackled softly, echoing in the quiet room. He thought of Lauren, her eyes steady, her voice gentle. If you ever want to talk. I'm still here. The silence pressed in, thick and patient, waiting for him to say something, anything, to no one in particular. She used to tell me I looked at her like I was seeing the future. Now she won't meet my eyes at all. The morning light broke softly through the linen curtains, casting golden stripes across the hardwood floor of the bedroom. Graham sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the closet door Lydia had left slightly ajar. She was in the shower. Steam crept out from the bathroom gap like breath from a secret. Somewhere between the noise of the water and the silence of the room, something tightened inside him. He wasn't sure why his gaze lingered on the purse Lydia had tossed on the bench the night before. Maybe it was the sound the leather made when it landed, a bit too heavy, too full. He wasn't proud of the way his hand reached for it. It felt beneath him. And yet he opened it. There, tucked in a side pocket, was the blue silk scarf he hadn't seen in years. Once, Lydia wore it nearly every Sunday. He used to tease her about it, the way it matched her eyes when she was younger, the way she tied it in that effortless knot. But this time, it smelled faintly of something unfamiliar. Not her usual lavender. Something sharper. Muskier. Folded beneath the scarf was a narrow receipt. A fancy restaurant downtown, Carlotta's. Graham blinked. It was dated Thursday. Lydia had told him she was working late on curriculum planning. The bathroom door opened behind him. Lydia emerged wrapped in a towel, hair damp, eyes already avoiding his. "You're up early," she said, walking past him. He held up the receipt. Didn't know Carlotta's catered school board meetings. She didn't pause. It was an impromptu thing. We were starving. We? Graham, she said, sighing. Not now. It's been a long day, and I haven't even started it yet. He nodded, folding the receipt and slipping it into his pocket, not out of malice, but because part of him needed it to be real. Tangible. He needed proof that what he feared wasn't just some trick of his imagination. Later that day, he wandered out to the garage. It was Saturday, And for years, Saturdays meant sorting tools, oiling hinges, pretending to fix what didn't need fixing. The leaves had started curling into the corners. He swept them aside and opened the drawer beneath the workbench, where he'd kept a few things from his brief stint with amateur ham radios. He pulled out a small GPS tracker still in its box, purchased out of idle curiosity long ago. His fingers hesitated over the packaging. He wasn't the spying kind. At least, he hadn't been. By afternoon, the device was discreetly attached to the underside of Lydia's trunk lid. He made sure to position it near the lining, where it wouldn't dislodge with the vibration of the road. Later, while running errands, he stopped by the local bookstore. Marcy was there again, behind the register, chatting with a woman about the upcoming book club meeting. Graham browsed aimlessly until he found himself in the back section near technology and DIY shelves. He flipped through a small guide on personal security and GPS tools, noting how surprisingly easy they were to use. As he paid, the woman in front of him lingered a bit too long at the counter, discussing moisturizers with Marcy. Graham didn't pay attention until he heard Marcy say, "I set aside the perfume for Lydia, just like she asked. The new one from Paris. You'll love it, very bold." Graham turned his head slowly. The woman, middle-aged, cheerful, just nodded. "I'm picking it up for her." She said it matched her new scarf. Bold. A new scent. Graham's stomach clenched slightly. Back home, he placed the book he'd bought on the hallway table. Lydia was already upstairs, music playing faintly through their bedroom door. Not the kind of music they used to dance to. Something distant. Modern. It made the space feel unfamiliar. He walked into the master bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. The light above buzzed softly. For a moment, he just looked at the lines by his eyes, the silver in his hair, the way his shoulders sloped slightly forward now. Years ago, Lydia used to rest her chin on those shoulders, whispering about growing old together. Now, she hardly touched him. "How did I become invisible in my own marriage?" he asked the reflection. It didn't answer. He turned off the light and walked downstairs, pouring himself a glass of water, careful not to let the ice clink too loudly. The quiet of the house now felt like a second skin, one he never asked to wear. He left Lydia's phone where she'd placed it on the kitchen counter while she showered. It buzzed once. Then again. A soft glow lit up the screen, and Graham, without touching it, read what he could before it disappeared. "Tomorrow. Same room. You know what to wear." She left in her favorite scarf and heels. Said she was going to Mary's. Mary called asking why Lydia hadn't come. The smell of unbaked pumpkin pie lingered in the kitchen, stubborn and unfinished. Graham stood by the oven, staring at the cold dish on the counter. The crust, perfectly crimped, had waited all morning for the filling that never came. Lydia had promised to do it after her shower. But now it was nearly 6, and the pie was still a ghost of a promise, like so many things in their house lately. He hadn't said much when she left, just watched her pull on the blue scarf she used to save for special days, slipping it over the collar of her wool coat. She wore the same heels he'd bought her for their anniversary years ago, the ones she once called too pretty for a small town. She paused at the door and said, "Don't wait up. Mary's got this whole thing planned." The silence that followed was almost expected. Graham nodded, watching the door close, the lock click behind her. She didn't kiss his cheek. He didn't ask when she'd be back. That had become their new rhythm. The phone rang an hour later. He nearly ignored it until the name Mary Connolly blinked across the screen. He answered on the third ring. "Graham? Hey, is Lydia okay?" Mary's voice was casual, then slightly unsure. She said she was coming by early for pie prep, but she never showed. He stared at the window. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the November dusk. "She said she was going to your place," he said flatly. "Well, she's not here," Mary replied, her voice dipping. "Thought maybe she got held up at school or something, but it's been hours." Graham thanked her and hung up. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, phone still in hand, thumb hovering over the contacts list. He thought about calling Lydia. Thought about asking. Accusing. Pleading. Instead, he placed the phone face down on the counter, beside the unfinished pie. A line from last Thanksgiving surfaced in his mind, Lydia handing him a small wrapped box after dinner, her eyes warm, a little misty. "I found our old photos," she'd said, placing the album in his hands. "From before things got busy." The cover read our years. He remembered how they'd laughed at the hairstyles, how they'd lingered over the picture of them on the coast, windblown and sunburned. This year, she hadn't even mentioned Thanksgiving. He walked to the hallway closet and pulled out the suitcase he hadn't used since his last business trip, 2 years ago. Quietly, deliberately, he packed. Just enough to leave. Not enough to make a scene. In the bedroom, he paused. The light on her vanity was still on. A bottle of perfume sat beside a gold hairpin. Neither had been there a week ago. On the nightstand, the silver frame holding their wedding photo had been turned slightly, facing the wall more than the room. Graham pulled his wedding band off and placed it gently on the kitchen table. It landed without a sound. He scribbled a single sentence on a torn scrap from the grocery list, setting it beside the ring. "You chose. So now I will, too." He didn't sign it. The last room he visited was the living room. He flicked off the decorative lights she'd hung, leaving only the small lanterns in the windowsill glowing. On the mantel, an unopened box of thank you cards sat beside a dusty tin of cinnamon sticks. A porcelain serving platter, passed down from Lydia's grandmother, rested and used beside it, waiting for a dinner that wouldn't happen. Outside, the night was falling soft and wet. Oregon in late November always seemed to weep, quietly. He stepped out onto the porch with his coat button and suitcase in hand. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and chimney smoke from neighboring homes. He glanced back once. The porch light glowed faintly through the mist, still on. Still waiting. "I never said goodbye." But silence can feel louder than a slammed door. The wind rolled in from the Pacific like an old friend with bad timing, slow, damp, and persistent. Graham had grown used to the hush that followed him, but in Eden Shores, even silence had a softer shape. His cabin sat tucked against a bend in the pines, where the sea was more whisper than roar and the days moved at half speed. He'd arrived in March with nothing but a duffel, a few worn sweaters, and a head full of echoes. No forwarding address. No return date. He told the landlord, a wiry man with a navy cap and a stutter, that he was starting fresh. The man nodded like he'd heard it before. Eden Shores was the kind of place where no one asked too much, at least not at first. People greeted you on the sidewalk, left fresh tomatoes on your porch in summer, and waved whether they knew your name or not. It was the first place in a long time where Graham didn't feel like his own shadow. He started working part-time at Moss and Maple, a bookstore that smelled of cedar and paperbacks, tucked between a post office and a breakfast cafe with chipped blue stools. Clara Jennings, the store's manager, was a widow who spoke in soft measures and knew the history of every book and every customer who bought them. She hired Graham on a Thursday after watching him straighten a crooked stack of classics without being asked. "You like order," she said simply. "That's good for books. They don't argue back." He liked her quiet way of noticing things without prying. She never asked why he came, only offered him hours, then coffee, and eventually, the key to open up on Sundays. On most mornings, Graham would sweep the front steps, unlock the doors, and set the kettle to boil. By 9, Ethan, a bookish 10-year-old with a cowlick and mismatched socks, would burst in, breathless, asking about pirates or dragons or mysteries with secret codes. Clara once confessed that Ethan's dad had left the year before, and Graham, without thinking, began teaching the boy to read aloud, line by line. "He listens to you," Clara said one afternoon as they restocked the travel section. "Better than he listens to anyone else." Graham just nodded. He wasn't sure how to respond to praise anymore. It felt like a shirt that didn't fit right, familiar, but uncomfortable. He spent his afternoons at the small library across the street. It was mostly quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of an elderly couple or a group of kids waiting for their parents. Clara worked there on Thursdays, and over time, their conversations extended beyond book recommendations. She'd started saving him a seat near the back, by the window overlooking the bluff, where the light filtered through in a soft gold. One Tuesday, as spring peeked through the mist, Henry, the local pastor, waved to him from the garden behind the chapel. They talked a while about the weather, about books, and about the homemade soup at the diner that was, in Henry's words, surprisingly philosophical. Graham smiled more than he spoke. Still, the town began to remember his face. One afternoon, while helping Ethan with Charlotte's Web, the boy looked up, suddenly serious. "Mister," he asked, "do you have a wife?" The question landed without warning. Graham looked at the boy's open face, his freckles arranged like ellipses across his nose, waiting. For a beat, Graham considered the weight of truth, of words left unsaid for so long they'd begun to fossilize. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled and looked out the window, where Henry stood chatting with the florist, both men laughing about something too small to hear. Graham nodded once, almost to himself. That evening, the bookstore glowed against the soft dusk, its windows throwing long rectangles of light onto the sidewalk. Clara was locking up when Graham returned a late drop-off. She handed him a slim paperback wrapped in brown paper. "Something I thought you might like," she said, avoiding his eyes. The tag read, "How We Begin Again." Graham didn't open it right away. He ran his fingers over the title, the texture of the cover beneath the paper, and tucked it under his arm. As he walked back to the cabin, the seaside beneath the cliffs, and the porch lights of Eden Shores flickered on, one by one. She kept my last name. But not the man. The rain in Portland had a way of reflecting everything too clearly: glass storefronts, slick sidewalks, the bright blur of passing headlights. It was louder here, busier, and nothing like Eden Shores. Graham stepped off the shuttle with Henry at his side, the city swallowing them whole as they made their way toward the towering hotel that hosted the state's largest education conference. Graham hadn't planned on coming. Henry had signed them both up for the Publishers Forum, insisting it would be good to step out of the tidal and into the stream once in a while. Graham had half smiled, packed a blazer he hadn't worn in years, and left his cabin reluctantly. The hotel lobby shimmered with chandeliers and the rustle of polished ambition. Lanyards dangled from necks, and conversations buzzed about grants, curriculum reform, keynote panels. Graham kept his coat on longer than necessary, hoping to stay invisible. They took their seats in the back of a grand conference room. Graham barely scanned the program, flipping through pages without looking, until a familiar name snagged his attention: Lydia Ellison, keynote speaker, Future of Literacy in Public Schools. He blinked. Before he could process it, the lights dimmed, and she walked on stage. Her presence hit him like a shift in wind. Lydia stood tall beneath the spotlight, her voice confident, the cadence of a seasoned speaker. She wore a tailored navy dress, her hair pinned in a loose updo that looked effortless but intentional. The crowd leaned in, taking notes, nodding. Graham didn't hear most of the speech. He watched her mouth form sentences she used to rehearse at their kitchen table, back when lesson plans were scrawled on napkins and they shared dreams over burnt toast. She was eloquent, poised, magnetic. Next to her stood Clayton. He hovered nearby like someone who belonged, too familiar, too comfortable. Graham caught the way Lydia leaned slightly when speaking to him, the hand on his arm as she laughed. No stage directions there. Just chemistry. And history. They stepped off stage together, Lydia's face lit by applause and camera flashes. She never looked toward the back rows. Never saw Graham sitting there, still, like a memory in a suit. After the crowd thinned, a young staffer from the event approached with a clipboard and a sealed folder. "Mr. Ellison," she asked. He hesitated before nodding. "This is for your company's records. The partnership Lydia Ellison just signed, it's with the education startup that submitted through the foundation you oversee, right?" Graham took the folder. "Right," he said softly, though it barely sounded like his voice. Inside was a copy of the agreement, Lydia's signature in sweeping ink across the dotted line. Below it, almost as an afterthought, was the corporate approval, Graham Ellison, founder. She had no idea. The irony settled like dust. He had helped approve the funding for a project she'd spearheaded, one that would get national attention. And she didn't even know he was still alive in her orbit. Afterward, he wandered the hallway in silence, passing conversations and handshakes that didn't need him. Henry eventually found him near the escalators, holding the folder like it might vanish if he blinked. "You all right?" Henry asked, tilting his head. Graham nodded once, then turned toward the doors. "Let's get out of here." The ride back was long, Portland's lights fading behind them like a closing curtain. The rain followed them, tapping gently against the windshield. Henry kept quiet most of the way until, just before they hit the coast, he glanced over. "You know her?" he asked, tone careful. Graham didn't look away from the window. "I used to. The ocean never asked where I'd been. It just kept coming back." The smell of smoked hickory and cotton candy lingered in the July air, tangled with the distant crash of waves. Eden Shore's summer fair had returned, and the whole town seemed to spill into the open green behind the church, where booths lined up like colorful beads on a necklace. Graham stood behind a folding table under a blue and white striped canopy, flipping burgers on a portable grill. His shirt stuck to his back in the afternoon heat, but he didn't mind. Sweat was honest. It reminded him he was here, part of something, however small. Children darted past with painted faces and sticky fingers. The mayor handed out lemonades. Someone tuned a guitar beneath the music tent where folk tunes drifted lazily over the breeze. From a distance, Graham spotted Ethan trying and failing to toss rings over glass bottles, his face scrunched in concentration. Graham called out, "Try aiming for the third row. That's the trick." Ethan looked over, eyebrows raised, then gave it another shot. The ring landed perfectly. His hands flew up in triumph. Didn't even need the prize, he grinned when Graham walked over. Just needed the win. Graham tousled his hair. Winning's its own reward. Nearby, Clara set up a table of home-baked goods. Her peach cobbler was already half gone. She wore a linen dress and sandals, her graying hair pulled into a loose braid. Her presence was unhurried, like she was built for moments like this, moments that didn't demand anything except being present. She waved him over during a lull. "Don't think I didn't notice you sneaking an extra slice of pie." "I plead guilty," Graham said, brushing off his apron and leaning beside her. "You're good with Ethan," she said. "You ever think about teaching?" Graham looked out at the field, kids racing in burlap sacks, old couples dancing slowly to the band's rendition of Sweet Caroline. "I used to think about a lot of things," he replied. Most of them stayed as thoughts. Clara didn't press. Instead, she nodded toward the bonfire being prepped. "Later, there's storytelling. You're reading, aren't you?" He chuckled. "Only if I can make the kids fall asleep halfway through." As dusk settled, fairy lights blinked on above the booths, and the scent of caramel apples mingled with the salt of the sea. Graham took his place near the fire pit, a semicircle of folding chairs filled with restless children and parents balancing paper cups of cider. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, the ink faded but legible. "This one's called To Begin Again," he said softly. A hush fell over the group. "To begin again is not to forget," he read, "but to forgive the silence. To meet yourself not as you once were, but as who you might become." A breeze lifted the words into the evening. He finished the poem with a gentle cadence, looked up to find Clara watching him, not with questions, but with understanding. She didn't need his past to see his present. Later, after the crowd had thinned and the fireworks fizzled out over the ocean, Graham sat on a picnic bench beneath the stars, letting the salt wind brush his skin. Clara approached with 2 paper cups of tea. "You didn't mention her," she said, sitting beside him. He glanced sideways. "Didn't have to." She passed him a cup. "Next time, let me cook." Graham smiled, the warmth of tea seeping through the cup into his hands. Next time? I changed my name. My job. My home. But the past still had my number. The morning air in Eden Shores had the bite of coming winter. The sea beyond the bluff was a dull gray, churning with quiet resolve. Graham sat in his usual spot at Mariner's Cafe, a booth by the window where he could see the horizon through a pane fogged at the corners. His coffee had gone cold, but he kept his hands wrapped around the cup for warmth. The place was mostly empty, just old Mr. Knowles rustling his newspaper near the counter and a young couple murmuring over a shared plate of toast. The radio hummed low in the background, playing a slow jazz tune that barely lifted above the sound of the waves. Graham had just opened his notebook when his phone vibrated on the table. Harold Dane. The name lit up like a ghost on the screen. He hadn't heard it in years. And yet, he hadn't deleted the contact. With a deep breath, he answered. Graham, Harold said, his voice still sharp, precise. It's time. The words settled like dust on old furniture. Harold explained quickly, Clayton was under investigation. Fraud, embezzlement, coercion. And Lydia may be caught in the mess, he said. Whether knowingly or not. Graham pressed the bridge of his nose. Why are you calling me? You're listed as a silent co-founder of the firm that received one of his largest deposits, Harold replied. We need your statement. And, we need the original contract Lydia signed in 2019. The one she signed without ever realizing his name was buried at the bottom. Graham didn't respond right away. He looked out the window, where the clouds sagged low and heavy, the same color as his thoughts. I'm not looking for revenge, he said finally. I know, Harold replied. But this isn't about revenge. It's about clarity. And maybe, helping her see the truth. Graham hung up without promising anything. The past had knocked, hard, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to open the door. That afternoon, he walked along the shoreline path behind the library. Clara was there, feeding breadcrumbs to gulls, her scarf tucked into her coat collar. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said. I might have, he replied. Or maybe it just never left. They walked in silence, their footsteps crunching against gravel. Sometimes I wonder, Graham said, if helping someone who hurt you is weakness or strength. Clara didn't look at him. Depends on whether you're doing it for them. Or for yourself. Later that evening, he returned to his cabin. The fire was low on the hearth, and his breath fogged in the cool air as he sorted through the old box under his desk. Contracts, emails, letters, each document a breadcrumb leading back to Lydia. He found the file Harold had mentioned. Her signature in blue ink. His name in fine print. The beginning of their end, etched in paper. He pulled out an envelope, slid the documents in, and sealed it. Then he hesitated. Would she know? Would she realize the person helping expose Clayton was the same man she'd once promised forever? He placed the envelope on the desk. Reached for a yellow notepad. Wrote a single line. It's not revenge. It's release. He didn't sign it. Didn't need to. The next morning, he dropped the envelope into the post office slot. As he walked back through town, nodding to familiar faces and passing storefronts dressed in early Christmas decor, he realized something strange. The town hadn't changed. But he had. I never prayed for her to fall. I only prayed I wouldn't break first. The fog rolled in early that morning, thick and slow, clinging to the glass of the cafe like it had something to say but couldn't find the words. Graham sat in his usual booth, the same corner by the window at Mariner's, where the sea would normally greet him with silver and blue. Today, it was hidden, just a wall of gray beyond the pane. His coffee was untouched. The warmth from the mug had long faded, but he still cupped it in both hands like something sacred might rise from its depths. Behind the counter, the fax machine let out a long, tired whir. The cafe's old radio hummed with the soft, flat voice of a local anchor. Breaking developments in the Clayton Edgemont investigation. New documents have surfaced connecting the former consultant to multiple shell companies. Graham didn't look up. He didn't need to. Across from him, Henry stirred his tea with slow, deliberate motions, the teaspoon tapping faintly against ceramic. "They say she resigned this morning," he said. Graham nodded once. "She's in the hospital. Exhaustion, they're calling it." Henry glanced up from his tea. "But we both know what it really is." He didn't respond. The silence between them was the kind that didn't need filling. "Edgemont remains unreachable," the radio continued, "but sources confirm Lydia Ellison, his former associate, has stepped down from her position at the State Education Board. Ellison, once praised as a rising figure in policy reform, is now under scrutiny for her alleged involvement in falsified contracts." Her name, repeated by a stranger's voice, echoed through the cafe like a memory he hadn't invited. Henry took a careful sip. "You okay?" Graham stared out into the fog where the waves should have been. "She collapsed. And I don't feel anything. Not even relief?" He shook his head. "Just empty." The door to the cafe creaked open, letting in a gust of damp air and a burst of conversation from the street. Clara walked in, her coat damp at the edges, cheeks flushed from the cold. She spotted them but didn't come over, not yet. Instead, she ordered a coffee and waited at the far end of the counter, giving Graham space he didn't ask for but deeply appreciated. Harold had called earlier that morning. "She didn't see it coming," he'd said. "The media move fast, Graham. Too fast. Clayton's vanished, and now everyone's looking at her." He hadn't asked for updates. He hadn't needed reassurance that his file had made a difference. But Harold added, "No one knows who sent the documents. I've kept your name out of it." Graham thanked him, then hung up before he could change his mind. Now, he stood outside the cafe, coat pulled tight, wind snapping at the hem. The ocean roared behind the veil of fog, louder than he remembered. He walked toward the shoreline path, past the bookstore, past the post office, to the edge of the overlook where driftwood piled like forgotten thoughts. The cold bit at his knuckles, red and stiff. He closed his hand into a fist. In another life, in another year, Lydia might have stood beside him, her scarf wrapped high, her breath white in the air. She might have leaned into him, asking what he was thinking. And maybe he would have told her. But now? He opened his hand. Let the fog swallow the tension, the ache, the long-held sorrow. Let it go. There were no fireworks. No triumph. Just breath, and space, and a sky too wide to fill. He didn't hear Clara approach. But he felt her hand, light and steady, resting gently on his shoulder. She didn't say anything. And for the first time in months, Graham was grateful for the silence. Some truths stay hidden not because they're dark, but because they hurt too beautifully to touch. Rain tapped lightly on the cafe's glass roof, a steady rhythm that folded itself into the quiet morning like a memory returning home. The place was nearly empty, save for a woman in a gray coat seated by the fireplace and a barista who moved without hurry. The scent of cinnamon and baking apples hung in the air, soft and warm, and the fireplace cracked gently, its light dancing against the old brick wall behind it. Graham sat at the corner table, his hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone lukewarm. The song playing, Autumn Leaves, was almost too fitting. He didn't know who had chosen it, but he didn't mind. It played like the background to a goodbye he had rehearsed in silence for years. When the door opened, a breeze curled in, trailing the scent of wet pine. Lydia stepped in. She wore no makeup. No earrings. Her hair was pulled back in a simple tie, and her coat hung on her shoulders like it no longer fit. There was a softness to her face Graham hadn't seen in years, not fragility, but something quieter. A surrender, perhaps. She spotted him instantly. There was no awkward scan of the room, no hesitation. Just a long look that said everything the years had kept buried. Graham stood and gestured to the seat across from him. Thanks for coming. I almost didn't. She took the seat and folded her hands in her lap. But then I realized I might never get the chance again. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't feel like tension, just the kind that stretches itself out when two people aren't quite sure where to begin. I got your email, Lydia said, voice low. It surprised me. Graham nodded. I almost didn't send it. The barista approached, offering a small pot of Earl Grey and a plate with 2 slices of warm apple tart. Lydia murmured a thank you, eyes not leaving Graham's face. I thought about writing years ago, he said. But I didn't know what I would have said that wouldn't sound like blame. She looked down at her tea. Were you blaming me? I blamed a lot of things, he said. Mostly myself. Lydia's gaze lifted. Her eyes were still that shade of gray that turned almost blue in the right light. You said you wanted to tell me something. Graham exhaled. Do you remember the miscarriage? She stiffened slightly, but nodded. Of course. I never told you what it did to me. Not really. He looked at the fire. That night. I remember holding the hospital bracelet, sitting on the floor in the kitchen. And I couldn't feel anything. Not grief. Not anger. Just static. Lydia's eyes began to shine. I thought, maybe it'd come later. But it never really did. Something just stopped. And when I looked at you, I didn't know how to say that I wasn't okay. So I said nothing. Her voice cracked. I always thought your silence meant you stopped loving me. He looked at her, gently. I never stopped loving. I just stopped being able to speak that love. Tears fell quietly from her lashes. She didn't wipe them away. I filled the silence, she whispered. With busy work. Conferences. Clayton. All of it. I know, he said simply. The rain continued its soft percussion against the roof. Graham took a slow sip of his now cold coffee, then pushed the tart toward her. She didn't touch it. Lydia leaned back, eyes closed. I don't know what I wanted when I came here. Maybe to explain. Maybe to ask for something. You don't have to, he said. We're not who we were. And that's not a bad thing. There was a quiet acceptance in her nod. She opened her eyes. If we had met now, as strangers, would you have loved me again? Graham smiled, not sadly, but with a tenderness that had no place for bitterness. He studied her, this woman who had once been his entire world and now sat before him as someone he finally saw clearly. I think I'd remember your eyes. Some endings are best written in ink. And left unread. The wind rattled the small panes of the cabin windows, and the scent of sea salt slipped in through the cracks in the old frame. It was a cold night, clear, but sharp with the kind of chill that settled into the bones, not just the skin. Inside, the only light came from the brass desk lamp Graham had salvaged from the antique store in town. It bathed the wooden desk in a warm pool of gold, while the rest of the cabin remained cloaked in soft shadows. He sat in his chair, a woolen throw over his shoulders, unmoving for a long time. In front of him was a sheet of thick paper, cream-colored, unlined, and the fountain pen Clara had gifted him last Christmas. Next to it, an untouched cup of peppermint tea slowly cooled beside a worn-out photo album he hadn't opened in years. There were no photos of Lydia in it. He had taken them out a long time ago. But somehow, tonight, her presence filled the room more than ever. The first words came slowly, almost stubbornly. You weren't just a chapter. You were the whole book. He paused. The pen hovered above the page like it was unsure if it had the right to continue. But then it moved again, quietly, steadily. And maybe I got lost in the margins. Maybe we both did. But I never skipped to the ending. I stayed. Even when you didn't. The waves outside were louder than usual. Graham could hear them crashing in a slow, patient rhythm, like the beating of something older than regret. He dipped the pen again, letting the ink settle. There was a time when silence was the only language I trusted. It felt safer than words. Words could betray. But silence just waited. It didn't ask for anything. It didn't expect forgiveness. He looked up. Across the room, on the wooden coat hook near the door, hung an old, pilled sweater. It was deep blue, hand-knit, a little lopsided on the sleeves. Lydia had made it one winter when they still lived in Westbrook. She had laughed the first time he wore it, teasing him for putting it on backward. He stood up, walked to it, and gently folded it, placing it inside the old chest beneath the window. Not out of anger. Just to let it rest. Back at the desk, he continued writing. I don't know where you are tonight. I don't know if the name Mercer still means anything to you. I don't need it to. This letter isn't for you, really. It's for the part of me that never got to say goodbye. He didn't sign it. He didn't address it. He folded the letter with care, pressing each crease with the side of his hand like sealing something sacred. Then, slipping on his boots and pulling his coat tighter, he stepped outside. The wind caught him instantly, sharp, briny, familiar. The path to the edge of the beach was lit only by moonlight and the faint glow of his porch lamp. He walked slowly, each step crunching softly on the gravel and sand, the letter clutched in his hand. When he reached the surf line, he paused. The waves came in, cold and constant, licking the shoreline with their soft ferocity. Graham stood there for a long moment, listening, not for a sign, not for a voice, but for his own breath. For that quiet knowing that something was done. And then, with fingers that no longer shook, he let the letter go. The wind took it immediately. It lifted into the air, spinning once like a leaf caught mid-fall, then danced down the beach and was lost in the dark. He never saw where it landed. His voice was low. Almost a whisper. Goodbye, Lydia. No one heard it. No one needed to. Only the ocean replied, endless, patient, and silent as ever. She never asked about my past. And maybe that's why I could imagine a future with her. The air inside the Eden Shores library smelled of cinnamon and old pages, wrapped in the gentle hum of soft jazz floating from a small radio behind the circulation desk. Outside, snow flurried in lazy spirals beneath the amber streetlight, dusting the sidewalks and windowsills. Inside, warmth radiated from the stone fireplace in the corner, where a few kids huddled on bean bags with picture books and gingerbread cookies balanced on napkins. Graham sat at the long reading table near the bay window, a well-worn copy of Leaves of Grass open in front of him. But he wasn't reading. Not really. His eyes drifted occasionally toward the checkout desk, where Clara stood speaking quietly to a woman returning a stack of mystery novels. She laughed at something the woman said, genuine and soft. That laugh had a way of loosening something in Graham he didn't know was still wound tight. The town's annual read in the new year was a modest affair, just a few late-night patrons, some sleepy children, and a sense of shared quiet. The library, usually closed at dusk, remained open until midnight. Clara had invited him weeks ago. You don't have to stay the whole time, she'd said. But we have cookies. And fireplaces. And no expectations. He had said no then. Said he had other plans, though he hadn't. But something had changed since. Tonight, when she asked again, he said yes. She walked over after helping the last patron, hands tucked into the sleeves of her knit cardigan. They say gingerbread soothes the soul, she said, offering him a crumbling cookie. Graham took it. Then I might be able to sleep again one day. They sat together, not close but not far, the way people do when words might come, or might not. Clara looked at the cover of his book and smiled. You always pick the ones that ask more questions than they answer. Graham shrugged lightly. Maybe I like books that don't pretend to solve everything. She looked at him for a moment. Or maybe you just want someone to sit with you in the asking. That silence fell again, not awkward, but honest. The kind that came from people who had lived through enough not to fill every pause with noise. From the corner, the fire crackled and popped. A boy giggled from under a blanket fort built from chairs and scarves. I used to think disappearing was brave, Graham said finally. But sometimes, it's just fear in a different coat. Clara didn't ask what he meant. She never did. Instead, she said, we all carry damage. Some just hold it more quietly. He looked over at her then, fully. She met his eyes without expectation, without pity. Just presence. I left a whole life behind, Graham said. A name, a house, a woman who, at some point, stopped looking at me like I was still there. Clara nodded, her gaze steady but soft. And yet here you are. He smiled, almost apologetically. I don't know what that makes me. Human, she said simply. A young girl approached the desk, sleepy-eyed, clutching a children's book and a crumpled ticket for the midnight bingo raffle. Clara excused herself with a squeeze to his arm, light, fleeting, but grounding. When she returned, the clock above the fireplace showed 11:45. She poured them both mugs of cider. 15 minutes until the new year, she said, handing him one. Does it feel any different? Graham took a sip. Feels quieter. She leaned back in her chair, drawing her legs under her. I used to think New Year's was about grand beginnings. Now I think it's just about noticing who's still around when the clock strikes. He looked down at the mug in his hands. Clara, he said slowly, as if trying the name on a new kind of sentence. She turned to him. Yes? Would you want me to stay? It came out as something between a statement and a question, hopeful but without pressure. She studied him. Would you want to stay? Yes, he said, without flinching. If you'll have me. Outside, fireworks began crackling from the far end of town, distant bursts of color that reflected faintly against the frosted windows. Inside, the children clapped. The old men from the local barbershop chorus started singing something slightly off-key. Clara smiled. The clock struck midnight. She turned toward him, eyes warm. Happy New Year, Graham. And for the first time in years, the words didn't feel like a reminder of what had been lost. They felt like an invitation. Some scars fade. Others stay. But all of them teach you who you are. The fog had lifted just enough to let the sunlight smear across the brick buildings of Eden Shores like a lazy watercolor. It was Sunday morning, and the town moved with the kind of unhurried rhythm that only places like this knew, where you could hear the same church bell each week and still pause to notice it. Graham Ellison stepped out of the small cabin that had, for the past several years, kept his story folded in quiet corners. He zipped his jacket against the January breeze and took the familiar walk down Main Street, where the sidewalks still bore the faint chalk drawings of last week's children and the bakery windows glowed with lemon bars and cinnamon twists. He passed the bookstore first, Moss and Maple, where a hand-lettered sign in the window read, New Year, New Chapters. It made him smile. From inside, a teen with dyed orange hair waved enthusiastically. Hey, Mr. G. He lifted his hand in return. Morning, Jules. A little farther down, outside the flower shop, Henry Coyle was arranging small potted succulents onto a table. The old pastor had retired from preaching but never from presence. He still wore that knowing smile, the one Graham used to find irritatingly accurate. Henry looked up and tilted his head. Finally stopped running, huh? Graham shrugged, the corner of his mouth twitching. Guess I found less to run from. More to walk toward. Henry chuckled, stepping aside to let an elderly couple pass. You know, there's a potluck next Sunday. Clara's bringing that apple crumble of hers. I told her she should put a warning label on it, might cause marriage proposals. Graham raised an eyebrow. Is that right? Henry leaned in, mock conspiratorial. Word is, she's saving the last slice. He continued walking. The boardwalk came into view, weatherwood leading to the sea. A few shopkeepers were sweeping porches or hanging open signs with sleepy hands and coffee breath. The sounds of Sunday in a town like Eden Shores, a distant lawnmower, the gentle ring of a shop doorbell, someone whistling half a tune and forgetting the rest. From behind, quick footsteps padded closer. Uncle G. Graham turned just in time to catch Ethan nearly crashing into him. The boy's scarf was unraveling, and his cheeks were flushed from running. You're not gonna leave again, are you? Ethan's eyes squinted in the sun, hopeful but wary. Graham crouched down. What makes you ask that? Clara said you unpacked the last box. He smiled softly. Then maybe I am staying. Ethan grinned. Forever? Graham ruffled his hair. As long as the cookies at the library stay fresh. They both laughed, and Ethan bounded off down the sidewalk, his scarf trailing behind like a comet tail. At the edge of town, where the boardwalk met the dunes, Graham found his spot, the old bench that faced the Pacific like a steadfast witness. He sat down slowly, pulling his coat tight, and reached into his pocket for the small leather-bound journal Clara had given him last Christmas. He opened to the final page and stared for a moment at the blank space. Then he wrote, "I no longer chase being understood. I choose peace instead." He paused. No flourish, no dramatic ending. Just truth. A breeze lifted from the water, carrying with it the scent of salt and cedar and something else, something distant and familiar. Graham looked up. Across the sand, near the trailhead, a figure appeared through the mist. For a moment, he thought he recognized the walk, the way the coat moved, the shape of memory folded into shadow. His breath caught. Lydia? Or maybe not. The figure passed behind a cluster of dune grass, then vanished. Whoever it was didn't turn around. And this time, Graham didn't stand. He didn't chase. He simply sat, letting the moment pass like the waves before him. Behind him, the town had come fully awake. The door of moss and maple swung open, and the soft chime of the bell rang out. The scent of espresso drifted through the air. Laughter echoed faintly from the library steps where Ethan had probably rejoined Clara. Someone was tuning a guitar near the cafe, strumming chords that sounded like an old song learning to be new. Sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the bookstore window. A single ray caught the steam rising from a fresh cup of coffee on the sill, making it glow gold for just a moment. And Graham Ellison, once a man who longed to vanish, now sat still, chosen, welcomed, and entirely present. He closed the journal, stood up slowly, and turned toward the laughter. Toward the light. Toward the life he had finally chosen to live. There's a quiet kind of courage in choosing to stay when it's easier to disappear. Graham didn't rebuild his life overnight, it grew slowly, like morning light easing through sea mist. And in that stillness, he found something deeper than revenge, peace. Pain doesn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes, it's the invitation to begin a new one, not in anger, but in truth. Like driftwood shaped by the tide, we're carved not by what leaves us, but by how we carry what's left. If you've ever loved someone who stopped loving back, if you've ever stood in silence and wondered where your voice went, this story is for you. Because healing doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes, it walks in quietly, carrying coffee and forgiveness. And maybe, just maybe, the softest goodbyes teach us how to say yes to ourselves.